Hey guys, it's Eric Costa here, and I am back with another video. Now, in this video, I'm going to talk about Africa. The question that is the title of this video, you could say, is why is Africa so poor? So, without further ado, I'm going to delve right into that question and flesh it out for you guys. From my own knowledge, from what I know thus far, I'm going to use that to paint the picture for you and explain why Africa is poor. The things that I'm going to touch on in this video are not the conventional pieces of knowledge that are projected towards our direction as young people on the television from the mainstream media in our history books. So I'm going to do my very best to paint a picture for you, so you guys can understand why Africa is in the state that it currently is in. So yeah, I guess we have to firstly start with the image of Africa that all of us see on a regular basis. The image of young children who are malnourished, who lack cleaning water in their locality, who barely get a bite to eat on a day-to-day basis. Mothers who have to cater to these children who are also malnourished. In Africa, you see war, conflicts that kill young babies, that kill mothers, that kill fathers, that destroy families, destroy homes, destroy villages. We always see the villages, we always see how that is, that atmosphere, that tribalistic village atmosphere that many of these people live in. And as I said previously, we see the impoverishment and how poverty stricken these villages are. Those are the images that are depicted on television, and they're usually depicted in advertisements. Encouraging us, motivating us to donate money towards a certain charity that pledged to try and end poverty within Africa. Now, there's many things wrong with those images. Why, for me personally, as someone who is of African descent and who's studying at the moment Pan-Africanism, not in university, but personally studying Pan-Africanism. I'm studying colonialism in my own free time. I'm trying to understand the damage that has been done to Africa. And the more and more I study, the more and more I learn, I realize that many of Africa's problems were created by Western colonial superpowers. And colonialism, for those who do not know, I think that the definition, and this may not be word for word, but with colonialism, you have a country ruling over another country and dictating the affairs within that country, the political affairs, the legislative affairs, the economic affairs within that country. I live in Ireland at the moment. It's a country I love. I adore Ireland, and I adore its history. Ireland was colonized in history by Britain, and Ireland fought for its freedom and obtained political and economic, and that's the important word, especially when you're dealing with Africa, economic sovereignty. And now now Ireland is a free country, operating at its own free will. Now with Africa, pretty much the whole continent was colonized, and with Ireland, it's a very small country, population of 5 million. But when we're speaking of Africa, we need to bear in mind that the whole continent was essentially colonized everywhere. And why it was colonized, and I think the difference between Ireland and Africa is, Ireland was given its freedom and liberty. It was emancipated primarily because the Irish fought for its freedom. And I love Ireland so much, and I love its history, so the rebels fought for their freedom. But Africa was not it was given in the 60s. It was given its political freedom as Ireland was, but not its economic freedom, primarily because every single natural resource on this planet is in Africa. Oil is in Africa. Gold is in Africa. There's a stone, a rock that's in the electronic device that I'm using to make this video, and your electronic device that you're using to watch this video, called coltan. You can only find that in Africa, and you can find that in abundance in the Congo. So the colonial masters from Europe needed Africa. They needed Africa. So they're holding on to many natural resources that are there. But I'm going to touch on that later in the video. And nonetheless, I just wanted to paint the image of the impoverished Africa, the image that we see so frequently. So in terms of why, I said that you can link that impoverishment to colonial masters in Europe and the Western world. In terms of why that is the case, I'm going to firstly take you back into history, to a conference, the Berlin Conference, which took place in 1885. And at the Berlin Conference, it saw many European leaders gather and assemble. And they assembled within Berlin, and they erected a map of Africa on the wall. And they took a black marker, and they cut Africa into pieces, segments. And they said, okay, look, that's where the gold is. Belgium, you can take that. Congo. This is where the oil is, for example. Northern Rhodesia and Southern Rhodesia, African states, former African states, England, you can take that, and they just chopped Africa into pieces and gave each leader their own piece of Africa, their own stake in Africa. And those pieces that Africa was chopped into at that conference have now become the African countries that we know today. Think about that for a second. So the countries that we know today as African nations were actually created by European colonial masters. They created the African nations within Africa. And the problem with that is, and the massive problem with that at the time, and it's still a massive issue today, was there's thousands and thousands of tribes within Africa. Many of them were remote, they weren't very close to one another, but they were conflicting. And the creation of these countries saw conflicting tribes being squished into an economic bloc. And that instigated many wars. And many of those wars that instigated the Berlin Conference are still ongoing to this day. So when you wonder why there's so much war in Africa, nearly all of it links back to the Berlin Conference. So bear that in mind. So that deals with the conflict, the war. But what about the poverty, Eric? Why is Africa so poor? So as I said to you, the 60s is when many African nations obtained their liberty, their political and sovereignty, but they didn't obtain their economic sovereignty. And I think the best example that I can use, because I could go on for days about Africa and how it's been exploited, but the best example I can use to show you how Africa, these nations didn't gain their economic sovereignty, is France and the French colonies. So France was one of it was, in my opinion, still is a major colonizer within Africa. They colonized many countries in Western and Central Africa. Many nations they colonized. And after they gave these countries their political independence, what they did was they made these nations sign a pact. And the name of the pact is the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. That's what it's called. And this pact saw 15 African nations put their central bank in France. Their central bank in France. So the bank for these nations are actually in France. And if these countries want to withdraw money, as far as I know, from these banks, they need to send a request that can be rejected by the French. So they don't actually have the right to the reserves within these banks. And that baffles me. That is crazy. On top of that, France, there's a colonial tax, something called a colonial tax, that these 15 countries pay to France. And this colonial tax was established because France claims that, we taught you people how to be civilized. We introduced you to the knife and fork, and we introduced you to Western civilized customs, so you owe us a tax, which I think is ridiculous. And I think one thing I'm going to say really quickly and briefly is we need to realize that people speak about Africa being underdeveloped and Africa being, far behind when it comes to progression within society sociologically. That is, I think that's an absurd statement to make. There's a difference between modernization and westernization. Just because you're not westernized doesn't mean you're not modernized. In Africa, Africans, we have our own culture, our own tradition. We can modernize in our own special way. We can modernize and obtain and maintain our African heritage, culture, and history. We don't need to modernize in a European way. That doesn't mean we're not modernizing. And for so long in Africa during colonization, I'll say this really quickly and I'll get back to France, Africans within their own continent were servants to Europeans that came there. So I said to you previously that when the Berlin Conference, when these economic blocks were being created, the people who were allocated that block, so let's say for instance Belgium had Congo. The Belgian people in Congo were seen as first-class citizens, and Congolese people within their own country were seen as second-class citizens. Apartheid, we know apartheid and we associate it with South Africa. It was all across the board in Africa. If you're a European in Africa, you were entitled to certain privileges that Africans weren't even entitled to on their own continent. So that is why, in my mind, I feel that African has been one of the most oppressed man and woman, of course, one of the most oppressed humans known to the history of the world. During the 60s, there was segregation in the United States of America. There was racism within Europe. If you go back home to Africa, there was apartheid. Where could the black man or woman go at that time? And I think that's a very interesting fact, and I wanted to portray that, depict that verbally really quickly so you guys can think about it. But nonetheless, back to France, okay? So France, the colonial tax being paid to France because France taught them how to be civilized. And to this day, that tax is still being paid. France makes $500 billion from Africa annually. They then invest that into the stock market to make trillions of dollars from Africa annually. Trillions. Think about that. That is oppression. That is suppression. That is economic rape. That is wrong. That shouldn't happen in 2019. The thing I love about Ireland is I see so many young people protesting about matters that affect us. I want every young person watching this video to learn about what France is doing to Africa. And let's start something. Let's do something. We protest about, so many people have opinions about the Israeli-Palestine conflict, the feud over there. And we're protesting about that. Let's talk the CFA franc. That's what the currency is called. That these African, by the way, they're using a French currency. This France, okay. Slow down. So let's protest about the banks that are in France, being held in France. Let's protest about the colonial tax. These are issues that should affect us as young people. If we believe in global solidarity and unity, if we believe in truly fighting poverty, this is things that we should be fighting against, because the UN have their sustainable development goals, to end poverty, they need to ensure that Africa is independent economically. But you have to think about who is behind the UN. Who are the major stakeholders in the UN? Can the UN speak against France for what they're doing in Africa? Is that possible? Do France have a massive stake to hold in the UN? Think about these things. Can these goals actually be obtained when we have massive stakeholders in the UN like France and Western superpowers who are still to this day economically exploiting Africa? These are the questions we need to ask. Nevertheless, I was saying there really quickly about the currency. So there's a currency that these nations use called the CFA franc. These 15 African nations are forced to use this currency, and they have to use this currency. And when the value, it coincides with the euro when it comes to value. So when the value of the French euro rises, the value of the CFA rises. If the French euro falls and if France is in a recession, these countries are automatically in a recession. They have no economic independence whatsoever. That is absurd to me. I think the CFA franc needs to be obliterated, and I'm not the only one to share that view. Of course, many in Africa are against the CFA franc. In fact, 22 leaders have spoke against the CFA. 22 leaders in Africa that have spoke against the CFA franc have been assassinated, and their assassinations have been linked to France, factually linked to France. It sounds crazy. We see Emmanuel Macron on the news. He looks like a man that promotes the also catchy and great sound bites of democracy, liberty, brotherhood, fraternity. But in reality, he's economically raping Africa to this day. We need to understand that, and we need to realize the hypocrisy that lays within the geopolitical arena. There's a former French president, I forget his name. He said that if France didn't have Africa, they would slide into the realm of a third world country. Okay? And I think that was a very interesting quote. I completely forgot his name, but if you look it up, you'll find it. And I think we need to take all of these factors into account when we speak about Africa and poverty within Africa. These countries that are paying this tax towards France are the poorest countries in Africa. These countries that are being economically exploited to this day by France are the poorest countries in Africa. How can it be the case that when 22 leaders try to speak against these neocolonialistic tactics being used by France, they were assassinated? How can that be the case? That is absurd. France. So this is supposed to be a major European Union stakeholder. That fights for international peace and unity, and they're doing this 15 African nations. That should not be the case at all. And I use France as an example because this has happened with many African nations, and that tied right into poverty, because these nations are not allowed to economically grow, and if they cannot economically grow, the citizens within those nations will not reap the rewards of the natural resources, the gold and the diamonds within those countries. For years and years on end, private companies have been engaging in trade with African nations, and African nations, some of these nations have made billions upon billions from trade with private companies. But the money that they make the people don't feel it. These leaders feel it. Evil dictators within Africa feel it. And that's the next issue I'm going to touch on. The dictators. There are many bad dictators within Africa that exploit Africa also, alongside the colonial masters. And they don't give them the people the economic the people don't feel the economic benefits and the economic trade and transactions that goes on between these dictator leaders and private companies or other nations. But one thing I'll say to link it back to the Western world again is many of these dictators are hand-picked by the very colonial masters that exploit Africa. Personally, you could say. Belgium is the best example of that. In Belgium, there was a man called Patrice Lumumba, an idol of mine. He fought for independence and liberty within Congo, not Belgium, sorry, within Congo. And Belgium was the colonizer of Congo. And Patrice Lumumba fought for independence for Congo. They obtained it in the 60s. He was the prime minister of Congo. He was a Pan-Africanist. He believed that Africa needed to be free from colonization and needed to be able to stand on its own 2 feet. He actually claimed that political sovereignty and social sovereignty is great, like that's good, but without economic sovereignty, it's nothing. And I completely agree. And I think what's happening right now in 2019 with France and Africa proves that. Nonetheless, Patrice Lumumba, I'm so sorry, sneezing. Patrice Lumumba, he was against colonization, and eventually, he wanted to keep Congo together and ensure that the reserves in a province in Congo known as Katanga was not being gripped onto by Belgium, so there's a long story short, anyways, he was assassinated, and his assassination was linked to Belgium and America, because all of these Western superpowers, they have a massive economic stake within Africa. You have to realize that. So he was killed by the Western world. He wasn't an evil dictator, but the man that they handpicked, the man that Belgium handpicked and supported, I shouldn't say handpicked, but the man that they backed was Mobutu, Joseph Mobutu, and he's one of the most cruelest, evil dictators known to Africa. He is a man who, his net worth, I think, was $5 billion at one point, and people within Congo were dying. They were impoverished on the street, and they didn't get to feel the wealth that the Congo was generated. And you must ask yourself the question, why? This is a man who's backed by the Western world, the very people that claim that they want to instill good, good values within Africa. They're appointing a dictator to lead an African nation. Why is that the case? So my people, this is all I have to say to you thus far. I'm definitely going to make more videos about this into the future, because I think it's completely underemphasized in the mainstream media. In our history books, it's not even touched on, and we need to learn more about Africa and why she is poor. I refer to Africa as a she, because she is the motherland, not just for me and black people and Africans, but she's the motherland for everyone. Civilization began in Africa, so the least we could all do for the very place that we all originated from is take care of her and make sure her children, Africans, and everyone within this world is living in a good way, in a right way, in a way where they have equal rights and opportunities, economic, social, and political opportunities. So yeah, guys, I hope you like my Christmas jumper, by the way. But nevertheless, this has been my video so far. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm definitely going to speak more about this and going into the future, and maybe I'll make another video recently, because I'm currently looking into it a lot, and I find it very interesting. And I hope this was a seed for you guys, that you guys can plant and gain, grow a plant of knowledge when it comes to Africa and how she has been exploited over the years. When you see poverty on the television, when they show you that when it comes to Africa, just know that there's a reason behind that poverty. Just know that many are exploiting Africa to this day. Many charity organizations, with all due respect to anyone who is willing to go out to Africa and make a change on the ground, many of the volunteers go there and they make nothing, within these charity organizations. But the people at the very top of the charity organizations, some of them are multi-millionaires. And I'm not saying that randomly. I was told that by a volunteer that worked for a charity organization. So that begs the question, why? What is really going on in Africa? So yeah, this is the video anyway so far, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, subscribe, share it around to your friends. I really want a lot of people to see this. And let's, share it around as much as we can. And let me know what you think of it in the comment section. I hope you all enjoyed it. Peace. Merry Christmas, by the way.